I have the special pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker. If I were to set the scene of this conference, I would say that we have baked a very beautiful cake. And now in this keynote address, we have the icing on the cake, or the cherry on top of the cake, in having Olivier De Schutter as our keynote speaker. I won't waste any time. I'll just give you a brief background to who he is. Olivier is the co-chair of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, IPES Food, and since May 2020 is the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. He has also served as the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food from 2008 until 2014, and was elected to the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. He is a professor at the Catholic University of Louvain and at the College of Europe, Natolin. He is also a member of the Global Law School faculty at New York University and is a visiting professor at Columbia University. A very busy man, but I know that he is passionate about the conversations that have been happening here and also about changing policies towards healthy food systems, which is the title of his presentation. I will hand over to him and give him the floor to give us his keynote address. Over to you, Olivier.
Thank you very much, Betule. Very warm welcome to all, and I'm delighted to be here. And thank you for your very kind introduction. I should say, however, that what you listed are things I've been doing in the past, and they're not things I am now presently doing. Otherwise, it would indeed be quite a lot for a single person. But thanks very much for this extremely generous introduction. So I guess I'd like to start by simply recalling that Africa is really the last frontier of a debate between two views of how agricultural development should proceed. One view that is inherited from the successes of the 1960s and 70s in South Asia is the Green Revolution view, in which agricultural development depends on the use of high-yielding varieties of plants and commercial seeds, depends on the mechanization of production, the use of tractors, depends on large-scale irrigation, including sometimes unsustainable use of water reserves, fossil aquifers, and the use of external inputs, pesticides, chemical fertilizers. And that view of how agriculture should modernize comes, of course, from the prowesses of the Green Revolution starting in the mid-1960s in South Asia, but of course, which originated in Europe and Northern America, and also influenced a lot developments in Central and Latin America in the 1950s. And then we have, of course, the opposite view, that of agroecology, that is based on the use of native seeds, using or betting on diversity rather than uniformity, harvesting rainwater instead of developing large-scale irrigation schemes, and using techniques such as biological control instead of pesticides, or leguminous plants, or certain types of fertilizing trees, such as Faidherbia albida acacias, in order to fertilize the soils instead of using chemical nitrogen-based fertilizers. And these are two quite distinct views, of course, of how we should develop agriculture in the future. Now, in the work we have done within the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, IPES Food, that Betule, you were kind enough to mention, and part of this panel is, of course, Million Belay, whose contribution is extremely valued within this panel of experts. Part of what we try to do in IPES Food is to highlight the benefits of opting for agroecology. And we highlight this not only, as most scientists tend to do, emphasizing the environmental dimensions of agroecology, better soil health, increased agrobiodiversity, a more economical and sustainable use of water, for example. We also emphasize the other dimensions of agroecology in a sort of 360 degrees approach to what the implications of the agroecological transition implies. And we emphasize, for example, the economic benefits of agroecology that can reduce the costs of farming, which is particularly important, of course, for cash-strapped small-scale farmers who do not have easy access to credit and cannot invest much in preparing agricultural production. Economic benefits also because agroecology shields farmers from the volatility of the price of inputs, since the production is delinked from the use of chemicals and chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and it reduces the dependency of farmers on input suppliers, including seeds companies. So it's a source of autonomy, of independence, and generally allows farmers to have more stable incomes, although the yields are not every year higher as a result. And I shall return to the question of the productivity of agroecology in a minute. So we have environmental benefits, we have economic benefits, and we have, of course, health benefits. Agroecology means a more diverse, a more nutritious diet for the populations depending on that kind of production. And it may therefore provide healthier outcomes for the population in a context in which a lack of micronutrients resulting from poorly diversified diets is now as important a threat to the health of populations as is undernutrition. In other terms, the lack of enough calories to keep alive and to have healthy and active lives. So we try to expand on these various benefits of agroecology, but we also identify a number of obstacles. In order for agroecology to become a true alternative, we believe a range of conditions should be fulfilled. And I'd like to highlight perhaps 3 conditions in particular, and I shall develop the third point only. The first condition is we need to encourage collective learning by farmers. And that farming should be learning should be accelerated, particularly by horizontal methods of exchanging knowledge from farmer to farmer. So farmer field schools, for example, with demonstration farms that can prove to farmers who may be skeptic how they can use these agroecological techniques, or farmers cooperatives who can allow this learning to proceed across members of the cooperative are very important, because agroecology is really something that is highly contextual. What works in one particular agroecological context or agroecological zone in one region would not necessarily be transposable to other regions. And so the way learning about agroecology proceeds is very different from the way ministries of agriculture usually provide support to farmers, assisting them and providing them with training sessions. Very often that provision of knowledge is top down in the hands of some technicians from the ministries of agriculture, but without any attempt to contextualize the knowledge. That is exactly what we need to do for agroecology. So that is really the first condition, accelerating collective learning in a way that is horizontal and context sensitive. The second condition is to organize a transition from the mainstream farming techniques and mainstream way of doing things to agroecological techniques. That may take a number of years. It is a multi-year process, and in this process, farmers should be supported, they should be accompanied, they should be protected from sudden income losses. And we need a range of public policies to support this effort towards a transition. This is why action plans adopted at country level are so important to effectuate this transition in order to stop being hostage to the short term and to the imperatives of remaining within one system with all its lock-ins that we have today. So that is, I would say, a second condition, which relates really to the governance of the transition from the mainstream approach to the one promoted through agroecology. The third condition, and the one I would like to expand a bit more on, is the organization of markets. And indeed, let us realize that there are many pressures on farmers to actually modernize, quote unquote, by adopting green revolution techniques. And I would like to highlight 5 key reasons why farmers are currently under pressure to continue to develop green revolution-like approaches and therefore not to move to agroecology. The first reason is very simply that in many country elites, the governments, the technicians from the Ministry of Agriculture have a view of progress that really sees progress as mimicking what was done in rich countries in the early 20th century, starting in the 1920s and 1930s. In other terms, there is a unilinear view of progress, and there is this conviction that industrialization, homogenization, uniformization, the adoption of commercial varieties of seeds is the only way forward. There is no other possible understanding of what it means to improve or to modernize. The second obstacle, the second pressure, is the pressure towards export-led agriculture. Of course, if you produce for global markets, if you produce for long supply chains, if you produce for commodity buyers that shall link your production to large food processors, food companies, and then to faraway markets, you have no choice but to practice the kind of agriculture that these buyers, that these firms demand. And that means more uniformity. That means using, for example, the seeds that are supplied to you by the buyer of your crops. And export-led agriculture remains extremely strong in the pressure it exercises on farmers in many regions of Africa, not least because governments have to reimburse a foreign debt. And you cannot reimburse a debt by encouraging the production of sorghum or cassava. You need to produce what high-value OECD markets demand, and it is by producing cocoa, by producing cotton, by producing rubber or tobacco that you shall be able to pay in hard currencies the foreign debt. And so I think there's a link between the weight of the foreign debt on the macroeconomic choices of a country and its trade policies on one hand, and the agronomic choices on the other hand, leading many governments to encourage farmers to shift to cash crops for global markets in order to increase the ability of the country to have access to foreign currencies in order to reimburse the foreign debt. The third factor that plays a role is, of course, the links that may exist in many countries between the elites, the governments on the one hand, and the export sector, or indeed the suppliers of inputs. And in various missions I did in a number of African countries, including Cameroon, Malawi, South Africa, and so on, I was struck by how the vested interests in the existing system were strong and had no interest in changing course, simply because the governing elites were so closely involved and were benefiting so much from the system in place. So that's a political economy question that I think is one that is worth asking. Fourth, there is, let us face this, there is a lack of trust in agroecology, and particularly in the ability for agroecology to to produce at high enough levels in order to feed the communities. Now, this lack of trust in agroecology leads to a sort of vicious cycle. Because governments do not believe it can work, they do not create the conditions for it to work. They do not invest in agroecology, in their agricultural policies, and therefore agroecology is never given a chance to prove itself and to become actually a high-performing type of agriculture. The lack of trust, the disbelief in agroecology also has its source in the way we measure productivity in standard measurements of agronomic performance. Usually what agronomists do is that they look at one surface of land, for example, 1 hectare, and they ask how much you produce of one single thing on that plot of land. So you will say, for example, that if we manage to produce 9 tons of maize, corn on this hectare of land, that's quite good. It's actually quite impressive as a performance. If you produce 3 tons, that's not quite as impressive. Now, of course, according to that ranking, agroecology does not perform very well. And the reason is that agroecology uses a combination of crops on the same plot of land, combining trees with plants and animals in cyclical processes in which these different components mutually support each other, as a result of which the dominant crop will not be produced at such high volumes than if you were opting for monocropping schemes. So agroecology can only be supported really if you insist on looking at the total output per surface of land cultivated and not on if you don't look only at the single dominant crop on that plot of land. And the total output in a well-managed agroecological parcel of land can be actually extremely impressive, as many studies have shown, and many of them are highlighted in the IPES food reports. It's also quite striking that the measure of productivity that is often used is, even though it can be impressive for agroecology, if you look at the total output, it doesn't make agroecology competitive. And so the suspicion vis-a-vis agroecology is also because under current market conditions, it is not as competitive as conventional forms of agriculture. And this is what I would like to develop further, this question of competitiveness, which asks us to question how markets are organized. And what I would like to suggest is that today we have really a sort of false dilemma that is imposed on farmers between either developing high value cash crops for global markets or long supply chains, and that requires investing in monocropping schemes and producing what the markets demand, following an economic logic of production, or farmers are relegated to subsistence-like agriculture, producing food crops to feed their families, their communities, using diversified cropping schemes without much support from governments. And I think we must overcome that dilemma. Neither of these two horns of the dilemma is really satisfactory, and we need to do something else. What we need to do is to reorganize markets in order for agroecology to become competitive and to become desirable and not only affordable, but profitable for the farmers who shift to agroecology. So what does this mean? To reorganize markets in order to make agroecology the sound, the reasonable choice that farmers shall make. It means, I believe, 3 things. First, it means investing much more in the expansion of local and regional markets, rather than investing solely or primarily in the development of global supply chains and export agriculture. Local and regional markets have been generally under-supported, underestimated. If you look at the communications infrastructure, for example, which are the roads that are built? Which are the silos that are built? Are they connected to the local consumers, or are they connected to the main ports and the highways that link the country to foreign countries? If you look at the processing facilities, are these decentralized enough across the country, or are they centralized, for example, in the ports from where the commodities are exported? Are consumers educated about the benefits of eating local foods, or are they instead incentivized to feed themselves on imported processed foods produced by international firms? So I think there are many tools that governments can use and are starting to use to promote local regional markets in order to rebalance the efforts and not to invest solely in the development, in the growth of global supply chains. The second way in which the markets should be reorganized is by organizing farmers into cooperatives. Now, I already mentioned cooperatives when I spoke about learning. I think it's an excellent tool for transfers of knowledge to take place from farmer to farmer. But cooperatives also can do other things. They can facilitate processing of raw agricultural materials. They can facilitate the marketing of food items by the farmers. In other terms, they can help farmers move higher in the value chain by providing certain public goods and allowing farmers to achieve some economies of scale within the cooperative. And then, of course, the cooperative means that farmers shall have a stronger bargaining power, both vis-a-vis the suppliers of equipment and inputs and vis-a-vis the buyers. And it means that farmers will have a more important political weight. I think the marginalization of farmers from political decision-making is one major explanation for the lack of investment in small-scale so-called family farms. And so farmers' cooperatives like farmers' unions can strengthen the voice of farmers in political decision-making. So local and regional markets, farmers' cooperatives, and the third tool to organize markets better is the use of public procurement. Look at Brazil, for example. It's a very impressive example. In Brazil, they have the Programa Nacional per Alimentação Escolar, the National School Feeding Program, PNAE, feeding 41 million children. And since 2009, in this school feeding program developed across Brazil, priority is given to family farms who practice sustainable types of farming. So there's a very strong support going to small-scale farmers, what they call in Brazil family farms, in Brazil, which is, I think, a source of inspiration for all of us. In Ethiopia, we have developed since 2012 the homegrown school feeding program that now covers, if I'm not mistaken, some 140,000 pupils across the country, and perhaps more now since the COVID-19 crisis. So school feeding programs financed by public funds are a good example of how local small-scale producers can be supported. But they're not the only example. In India, for example, we have, since many years, a public distribution system, PDS, now renamed the Targeted Public Distribution System, the TPDS, since 1997. And that system provides subsidized food items to families below the poverty line in India by buying from small-scale farmers in India. This is a huge program. It covers 160 million families, which is probably about 400 million people, about 1/3 of the Indian population. It's a huge program, and it provides a decent income for farmers, encouraging them to to be productive, given the guarantee they will be able to sell their crops. Now, the use of public procurement as a development tool has been encouraged, for example, by the Sustainable Development Goals adopted in 2015 at UN level. Target 12.7 is about public procurement as a development tool to fulfill the other Sustainable Development Goals. And within the WTO, we've also witnessed since 2014 a change in the government procurement agreement, one of the agreements of the WTO, to allow countries to use public procurement as a tool for rural development and for the ecological transition, by including environmental conditionalities and by supporting small-scale farmers in particular. Now, of course, that is not relevant for Africa because the government procurement agreement of the WTO is a plurilateral agreement. In other terms, it is not all WTO members who have to agree or join that agreement, and no African country has joined this. But in Africa, we have public procurement rules adopted by the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, COMESA. And these public procurement rules of 2003, it's a directive actually on public procurement, supplemented by public procurement regulations in 2009, they allow African countries to do the same. And so although there is no obligation for governments to use public procurement as a tool to support family farms and to support agroecology as an agronomic practice, it is certainly an option that governments are allowed to use and that they should perhaps use more. So that would be, Betule, my short answer to how can agroecology be better supported, why it must be better supported, which are the tools, the levers that governments may use in order to do so. And I think, yes, the organization of markets has a key role to play in this regard. Many thanks.
Thank you so much, Olivier, for that very, very rich and very insightful description of how we can change policy and also how we can change or reorganize the markets to be more competitive, to be more desirable, and to be more viable for those that are practicing in agroecology, especially farmers, to get what they need to get in terms of economic viability.